Well, for joining in on this presentation about plants and their pollinators. So I am Kelly and I work on the BeltLine, taking care of all the native plants in the prairie and also all the trees as well. So I have given this a rather verbose and ornate name, Radical Dwelling, Conservation Gardening for Pollinators, People, and Planet, because today we are going to be talking about plants, we're going to be talking about the pollinators that depend on them, and we're going to be talking about how you can put them into your own yards. And so that's conservation gardening in action. That is actually doing something that is tangibly contributing to the world. And I'm calling it radical dwelling because the word radical comes from the Latin for root, and it means relating to or affecting the fundamental nature of something, far-reaching. And so when we look at our homes differently and we look at them as an opportunity to give back to the whole world, we are doing something radical and we're really inhabiting our place and we're really creating a sense of place in our own home. So with that, let's jump in. First of all, I'm sure most of you know the importance of pollinators, but just to kind of go back into their importance, they are crucial for maintaining a healthy, productive plant community. So they and plants are at the bottom of the food web, and all life really depends on them. So we know that if we have a great diversity of plants, then we also have a great diversity of pollinators, and vice versa. So they're also, in particular areas, if you are to count pollinators, that is directly linked with the health of the overall community. I have a picture here of a chickadee holding a caterpillar. And that's just to remind us too that not only are they doing the work of pollination, but invertebrates are also feeding other wildlife. So chickadees and other birds completely rely on caterpillars because they're so full of fat and good proteins, and that is what they rear their young on. Here in Georgia, we are in a state that really depends a lot on agriculture for our economy. And I've shown here two examples of plants that have to have pollinators to produce their fruit. So blueberries and watermelons. Without our pollinators, we wouldn't be able to enjoy those delicious foods in the summertime. Here in the Southeast, we stay really warm most of the year. And with that comes a striking diversity of pollinators. So I've read that in the United States, there are 4,000 native species of bees. And in Georgia alone, there are 500 species of native bees. And some of those are specialists. So we have the southeastern blueberry bee, the hibiscus bee, and the squash bee. And so these are bees who have evolved with these plants. So they can only really get nectar and pollen from these particular plants. And so the plants depend on them for pollination so that they can continue to thrive as well. Doug Tallamy is one of my personal heroes. He wrote a book called Bringing Nature Home, and he is an entomologist who studies the connections between invertebrates and plants. And in particular, he really loves looking at the different caterpillars that you can find all on the bottom of oak leaves. And he, I think, sends us a really important message. He is advocating for something he calls homegrown national park. So what he says is, 85% of the United States is privately owned. And yes, we have amazing national parks where there's a lot of biodiversity, but we have a unique opportunity to bring that biodiversity into our homes. And he says, garden as if life depended on it. And it does, it really does. And we have this chance to make our places inhabitable to many more forms of life than just humans. So planting native wildflowers is the best thing you can do. And I forgot to mention this, but I learned recently that to make 1 pint of honey, honeybees need to visit 5 million flowers. So if you think about that, it shows you just how many plants we need to have a thriving world. We won't go too much into this, but I did want to mention this really great book called Planting in a Post-Wild World. It's really good for helping you figure out how to design a planting in your own yard that's beautiful and functional. And one of the key things I'd want you to think about while we go through this is thinking about how much sunlight you get in your yard. Even if you just have a porch, how much sunlight does it get? If you do have a yard, is it Does it stay pretty wet or is it sandy? All of these things are going to play a role in deciding what you plant in your yard. And I'll try to point out which plants like shade and which plants like sun, but that is going to be something important. So here are just some examples. I just wanted to show you how, even if you have the smallest amount of space, you can really pull in pollinators in any space. Here's a hummingbird garden. So you see lots of reds and purples to draw in the hummingbirds and a hummingbird feeder. Here we have a big shrub in the middle. I think it's anise, and then there are some wildflowers around it. So you can bring in so much color and so much beauty into your yard at the same time as you're helping feed pollinators, and therefore keeping a whole ecosystem healthy. So I'm going to be talking with you today about some of the specific plants that you could actually put in your own yard. And it's important to remember that pollinators need a source of nectar and pollen throughout the growing season. So I'll be talking about plants in terms of when they bloom. Are they an early season bloomer or a late season bloomer, or do they fall somewhere in between? And if possible, it's important to choose plants that fall into all of these categories. So our early bloomers, and this is important because here in Georgia, many of our bees actually will hibernate. You may not think about bees as hibernating, but just like black bears do, the bees do. They will burrow themselves underground under the frost layer, and some of them will actually release an antifreeze into their blood and crawl into a little crevice in a tree and then emerge at the first feeling of spring. So when they emerge, they're hungry. Golden Alexanders are one of the things that you can plant. And this is a great plant because you can plant it in clumps, and it just has this brilliant yellow color first thing in the spring, and it attracts lots of different butterflies, and it attracts lots of different bees, native bees, of course, bumblebees, sweat bees. I have here a calligrapher fly, which it also attracts, and it looks a lot like a bee, but it's actually a fly. And this fly in particular is great to have around because it eats aphids. And aphids aren't all bad, but they can cause a lot of problems in your garden. So if you have a plant like Zizia and it attracts those calligrapher flies, it can help eat some of those aphids that are eating your plants. And so it can help actually decrease your need for pesticides. Wild indigo is one that I really love, and it's a legume, so it's a nitrogen fixer, which means that it can take atmospheric nitrogen and then make it available for plants. So it's really good for building soil up, and it's also just really beautiful. So it is primarily pollinated by bumblebees. And you can see in this picture down here how this bumblebee is poking its head into the flower. And you might not think that that takes a lot of strength, but actually a lot of our smaller native bees can't do it. So it really, this plant, Baptisia, it really relies on the bumblebee to be able to grasp onto the petals with its back legs and its mid legs and then propel itself into the flower. And the bumblebee is the perfect size to do that, and so it's able to pollinate this plant. And here are a couple of the caterpillars that you might see on this plant if you were to plant it, because it's a host plant for them, meaning that these butterflies and moths will lay their eggs on the plant, and then when they hatch, they'll eat the leaves. So if you do plant something and you see a little munching on the leaves, know that that's okay. That doesn't mean the plant's not healthy, it's just providing food. Now, I do want to offer up some ground cover when possible, because I think a living mulch layer of plants is really a good idea because it can help keep out weeds, and it's also just incredibly beautiful. It can spread well and then just draw in countless butterflies. So this is Robin's plantain. It has small white daisy-like flowers, and it's really a butterfly magnet. So here are just some of the butterflies you might see if you plant it. And it's a host to the checkered white butterfly on the bottom. And the plantain does like sun, but if you're in a shadier area, the iris cristata, this dwarf-crested iris, is a great ground cover for you. And it pulls in hummingbirds as well, so it's pretty exciting for a hummingbird garden. And those flowers are beautiful in a shady kind of woodland habitat, mixed in with some ferns and some other spring wildflowers. So at this time of year, it's actually not completely ideal to plant these perennials that we're talking about. I'm offering them up because sometimes it takes planning to design a pollinator garden. So it's something to be thinking about. You can always start prepping your yard for planting in the early spring. But if you're really eager right now, you can plant a shrub or a tree. And the Eastern redbud is one of my favorites. It just has these beautiful purple blooms that just adorn the bare branches first thing in the spring. So it just brings one of those first bursts of color after the winter. And it's really great for bees, for a source of nectar. Butterflies love it, and they use it as a host plant. So there's this butterfly, Henry's elfin, and the caterpillar takes 2 different forms and can be a variety of colors in between, but it's striking no matter what, and it would be a really fun one to see. You might also notice some little holes, little hole puncher holes on the side of these heart-shaped leaves. And if you see that, that's a great thing because that means that you're helping a leafcutter bee line its nest. The red maple and the serviceberry are 2 other early spring trees. The red maple also has the added benefit of beautiful fall color, and the serviceberry has the added benefit of edible berries, and they're really delicious. They taste almost like a mix between a blueberry and a Jolly Rancher, but very, very delicious no matter what. The birds also love them, so you have to beat the birds to it, but it's a beautiful tree to have. Those white flowers just completely adorn it, just like with the redbud. All right, so now we have early to early mid-season bloomers. The blue phlox is another plant that spreads like a ground cover in shady areas, and it draws in one of my absolute favorite pollinators, which is the hummingbird clearwing moth. And this is a moth that's just absolutely a delight to watch because it looks just like a hummingbird, but it's not. It's a moth, and they're amazing. There are many different kinds of them, but this one in particular really loves this phlox. And then the phlox plant bug can come in and eat the leaves. And again, that's a great sign you're providing habitat. All right, so the milkweeds. I'm sure many of you have heard of how important the milkweeds are for our monarch butterflies. So the milkweed actually has toxic leaves, but their caterpillars are able to eat it because they've evolved together. And so the monarchs lay their eggs on the milkweed, and they get to avoid a lot of predators because eating the milkweed leaves makes them slightly toxic to predators. So it's a really beautiful relationship in the natural world. But if you plant milkweed, you won't just get monarchs. You'll also get countless other butterflies, fritillaries, hair streaks, many different swallowtail butterflies, the Cynia tiger moth, just all sorts of butterflies. And the good thing about milkweed too is that there are many different species of it. So no matter what your yard is like, you'll find one that can work for you. So there are some shady species, some sunny ones, and even a swamp milkweed that really loves wet soil. This one is a great plant if you want to put seed out. So if you have a really big area that you just want to fill up with flowers, this plant comes up really easily from seed. And it's also great because after it flowers the first time, you can chop off the head of the flower, the seed head, and that'll encourage a second round of blooming later on in the season. So then you'll just keep on feeding native bees and butterflies for longer into the year. The beard tongue is a really important flower for bees. So this is one that the Xerces Society has called special importance for bees, for native bees. So you can tell it kind of has this tubular shape that's perfect for a bee to crawl inside of. And it just gets itself covered in pollen when it does it, and then goes from flower to flower and continues pollinating them. There are some species of this that like the shade as well, and some that like the sun. And it's a host plant to one of my favorite butterflies as well, the buckeye. These are two more ground covers that you might consider. Foam flower really likes woodland areas that are shady. And the green and golds, they also like the shade, but they can tolerate a bit more sun. and both will pull in butterflies. The green and golds in particular will pull in those calligrapher flies. So once again, something good to help eat the aphids and control pests. Here are two more tree options for you. I know most blueberries are shrubs, but there's actually a small tree form one, which is Vaccinium arboreum. And it's really beautiful. If anyone's been hiking up in North Georgia and seen the rhododendron up there with their kind of peeling bark and cinnamony red color, this blueberry can actually look quite similar to it, its bark anyway. And it does produce edible fruit. So once again, something that's really good for you and absolutely crucial for bees. So a lot of those specialist bees that we talked about earlier, they really like the blueberries. And there are lots of different species that are native to Georgia. So once again, you have a wide range of options, whether you want something small or something big like this. The pawpaw is one of my favorite trees. And if you do plant it, plant at least 2 or 3 because it needs to be cross-pollinated. And over time, it'll get to the age where it can produce a beautiful and delicious tropical tasting fruit. And it tastes like a banana and a mango and pineapple kind of all mixed together. And you cut it open and it's just creamy like a custard or some kind of smoothie. It's just amazing. And it's unreal that it's native to this part of Georgia, but it is. And it's good because instead of butterflies, it actually calls in beetles and flies to pollinate it because its flowers smell almost like fermented fruit, which doesn't sound great, but really isn't so bad. So now we have mid-bloomers. Blue-eyed grass is not a grass at all. It's actually in the iris family. And it produces prolific little purple flowers that many different species of bees and wasps really, really love. And when I say wasp, I haven't really mentioned those yet, but just like the calligrapher flies, the wasps are really great because they can actually kill some of those pests that we don't want in our yards. And they don't want to mess with us. They really just want to mess with the flowers. Fire pink is another one that I would suggest planting if you have a shady area and you're really interested in hummingbirds. So this one's really great too because it can spread really easily from seed and it can over time just kind of spread itself so that you have plenty of red all over your yard. Rudbeckia is a black-eyed Susan, and this one is also really great, like a lot of the ones we're talking about, with many different species of butterfly. We have this Gorgon checker spot here, and this is some kind of flicker. So it's another great one, and this is one also that birds really, really love. So flocks of goldfinches will come through and you'll see them perched on the seed heads, munching up the seeds. So with this one, you're helping out pollinators and you're feeding birds when they're migrating often. This one is another fantastic one, like all of these plants. It's a rattlesnake master. And it can get quite tall. It can get over time up to 6 feet tall. So you would need it in an area where it could kind of be more of a centerpiece. And it's incredibly attractive to all kinds of pollinators, including the moth in the center is the Eryngium stem borer moth. And this is a moth that's actually a candidate for the endangered species list. So if you have space for a rattlesnake master, there's a chance that you'd also be providing food for the stem borer moth and, you know, helping provide habitat and a place for that species to continue existing. It also attracts all kinds of beautifully iridescent beetles and, again, the buckeye, tons of butterflies, and predatory wasps. Monarda is in the mint family, so it smells great, and it has medicinal property. It also has great value for the hummingbird clearwing moth, so another one that you can attract that little visitor who I promise will be a delight to watch. Lots of other butterflies are attracted to this as well. The hermit sphinx moth lays eggs on this plant. mid to late season bloomers. This plant is fantastic, but also gets quite tall. So it's one that typically you would see growing alongside creeks and really wet areas. If you have a low spot of your yard that gets wet, it would be a good one to put there. But it can get up to 6 or 7 feet tall, so quite tall. It's very beautiful, and it hosts up to 28 different species of butterflies and moths. So it's really, really great for pollinators. It has this specialist bee, the rose mallow bee. So it's really great for keeping that bee around. And you can just see from some of these pictures, just the variety of caterpillars that you could see on a plant like this. There's a whole family of moths called the bird dropping moths that look like bird droppings as a protective mechanism. And you might see one of those on this plant. The Io moth is great, and you're sure to see those caterpillars, but also the moths visiting to lay their eggs. The blazing stars are also just an incredibly beautiful plant. They attract tons of butterflies. Everywhere that I've seen them, they're typically just covered in moths and butterflies. And you can just tell from their color that they're going to be a great addition to your yard. And there's a picture here of a monarch on it, because when the monarchs are migrating, they need nectar. And this is one of the plants that provides migrating monarchs with nectar. Here is a mountain mint, and just like the Monarda, this one smells really good, and you can use the leaves for teas and different tinctures and things like that. So it's great for humans as well, but pollinators love it. I have some of this in front of my house, and it's just buzzing. I mean, as soon as it starts blooming, the pollinators come, and it's just buzzing. You can sit there and see so many different visitors to it, and it's really a delight. And once again, it smells good, and that's always really fun. You can see from some of these pictures just how completely covered the bees get when they visit it. And again, it does attract the predatory wasps, but I assure you, I used to be kind of scared of wasps and bees, and they never mess with me. I'm completely over it. All they want to do is just hang out on that flower, and that's all. That's it. So here is a tree and a shrub for later on in the season. Sourwood, you might have heard of because of sourwood honey. And the tree itself is referred to as the bee tree because bees love it so much. The flowers, you can see they're very small. It's hard to even really see the flowers, but the bees will visit it for sure. And just like with the red maple, this is one that turns just brilliant shades of oranges and reds in the fall. So it's great for that. They're often pretty, if you see them in the wild, they have very interesting kind of twisty shapes, and their bark is referred to as alligator hide bark. So it's got interesting features all around. And the button bush is one that, in this picture, you can see it's almost hedge-like, but it can take quite a lot of pruning. So if you plant this, you can actually prune it to look more like a small tree. And it's one that actually people will try to replace what we call butterfly bushes, or different species of Bouteillea, which is not a native shrub. You can replace that with this, and it will pull in just as many butterflies. The flowers smell sweetly fragrant to us and absolutely delicious to the butterflies. You can see on the right that there are different varieties of very showy, large moths that are drawn to it as well. So the hydrangea sphinx, the Titan sphinx, and the royal walnut moth. And so now on to our late bloomers. These are really important here in Georgia because, like I said, we stay warm throughout the year, although I am very happy with the cooler September we're having right now, to be honest. But there are still pollinators about, and they need something to consume. So the swamp sunflower is one thing that you could plant, and it's a plant that does get fairly tall. It can get up to 6 feet, so I would suggest you putting this in an area close to the hibiscus, if you were to plant hibiscus, they would go really well together, and they both would occupy a similar niche vertically. These have some specialist bees that are called longhorn bees, and I think they're pretty adorable. They have really long antennae that are called the longhorns, and they do specialize on various sunflower species. So goldenrod is one that is wonderful, but it can get quite unruly, and it can be very tall. But this species, wrinkle leaf goldenrod, it tops out at around 3 or 4 feet, so it's not a giant, and it really doesn't spread like crazy. So it's a great one because the monarchs love it when they're migrating, because it does bloom later on in the year. It also offers color to your yard when not much else is blooming. And of course, it brings in the pollinators. Also, I have made goldenrod cornbread. So if you're interested in what you can do for yourself with native plants, that's something you can do with goldenrod. White wood aster is a late season bloomer that loves the shade. So this is a really good one if you do have a shady area. You can plant this with a lot of ferns. You could mix in some of those irises that we talked about earlier, and you'd have a really lovely shade pollinator garden. This one, just like with the mountain mint that we saw earlier, just buzzes with pollinators as soon as it starts blooming, and it's really fantastic for our native bees. And then up here we have the pearly crescent and a checker spot butterfly, which use this as a host plant. So I wanted to offer up a vine as well. This is by far, I've said this probably about a lot of the plants, but this is one of my favorites. It's purple passion flower. It produces an edible fruit, so good for us, but also the best thing about it to me is just the flowers are stunning. And if you plant this, Gulf fritillaries will find it. So the Gulf fritillaries come and they lay their eggs, and you will see little orange caterpillars enjoying the leaves. The butterflies continue to visit the flowers afterward, and they're also pollinated by bumblebees. I took this video and I'll see if I can play it. So it's perfectly designed. The bumblebee's body perfectly fits this flower. So the structure that holds the pollen, the stamen, it kind of hangs over like a little shower head, and the bee fits right underneath it, and the pollen brushes onto the bee's back, and then right next to the structure that holds the pollen is the the pistil, the female structure, and it's sticky, so then it takes the pollen and the bee continues around in a little circle, and it's very delightful to watch, and it shows you how perfectly these plants and their animals are interconnected. So it's a really fun one if you have kids around ever. I love showing it to kids on the BeltLine. It smells really great, and again, those passion fruits are pretty good. This is shrubby St. John's wort. It's another one that blooms late. It has lots of yellow flowers. The bees and butterflies love it. And the last plant, I think, is witch hazel, which again is something that you could plant now. And it's wonderful because it blooms into the winter. And it's great because here in the South, we'll have really cold days, and then it'll get warm and pollinators wake up and they need something to eat. And if you have witch hazel, they can just go to that. So it's a brilliant, beautiful plant to have, and you're doing something really great for the pollinators too. I just wanted to end with a slide that has some quotes. So I won't read them all, but I just think, with the title, what I'm going for is just to know that if you do put things like this in your yard, it is definitely because it's beautiful, but it's also world changing. So E.O. Wilson said, "I will argue that every scrap of biological diversity is priceless, to be learned and cherished, and never to be surrendered without a struggle." So when we put these plants in our yard, we're loving them, we are not surrendering them, we are keeping them around, and I think it's one of the best things that we can do. Some of my very favorite plants are here as well, and they're ones that could be found in woodlands. So we've got trout lily right here. And then we have some Dutchman's breeches, which are fun. And one of our native orchids, which is the cranefly orchid. And over here, a bobcat and flowers, because who doesn't love seeing a cat with flowers? So I have been neglecting to look at questions